I would like to thank Dr. Malakish and the others of the Africa Center for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and especially because it's definitely one of those experiences where you teach by listening. You learn so much by interacting with people who have had the direct experience. Yes, I am an economist, but I did make a tour of the social sciences. I also have studied anthropology and sociology and a few other fields, but I ended up in economics. Was thrilled to hear your discussion this afternoon, especially because you mentioned Colombia, which is an area where I worked while I was in college. I spent a summer there. And I can say that I was in Colombia so long ago that there were no drug traffickers there. Can you imagine? So it's hard to imagine. But one thing I'm aware of then is the tremendous potential that Colombia has. And I want to remind you of something. You were talking about Plan Colombia, about the security dimension, the economic dimension, but there's another dimension, and that is the political. And the reason that the guerrilla movement started is because there was a political impasse there, where a large part of the population felt shut out of the political process. It felt that there had been a deal where two parties just took turns running and other people were left out. Does this begin to sound familiar?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we have a situation there that reminded me very much of what I read in your syllabus about this plenary, was that we will be discussing the institutional framework for the security sector budget. And that framework is shaped by national security strategy, economic sustainability, and democratic civilian oversight. So there are actually three parts of this puzzle. And one other thing I've been involved in recently is complexity studies. I don't know if any of you have, you can just take courses online, teach yourself complexity analysis, which is, yes, mathematical, but it's how you study a system that doesn't have easy solutions. And what we're talking about here are complex systems. So it's not you add $100 million in aid and you have this outcome. Or you do $100 million worth of trade and you have that outcome. There is the political, the economic, and the security all interacting so that there are varying outcomes that you might have. Now, you say I should be talking about budgets, but is that really what I want to talk about?
Perhaps not.
Because I remember that there was a time when we all thought we learned a lot about leadership when we read Peter Drucker, who said that there were 7 habits of highly effective people. And one of those habits was to begin with the end in mind. So what is our end? What is our goal? Is my goal in having resource management in an African country, is my goal to have a wonderful flow charts with the terrific budget process, with assigned roles, supported by state-of-the-art technology systems, bought from the US, of course. But is that my objective? Or Is my objective security? Do I want to think that the objective is for people to live peacefully? National security and personal security. So, if in fact my objective is security, the only way that I can judge the budget process is by whether or not it is supporting the country's national security strategy. That's the only way that I can do it. And so when people say, well, how much should a country be spending? And the Stockholm Institute for International Peace, the Stockholm International Peace Institute, SIPRI, publishes every year. You can see whether a country is spending 2% of its GDP on defense and security, or 3%. And people say, well, how much should that country be spending? And you really can't answer unless you understand what are the threats, what are the capabilities, and what are the objectives. So that's where we begin and where we end, is with actual security and well-being. It is complicated, it is complex, but I want to report that it is possible. May I have the next slide, please? Then when we look, right there, excellent. I can be self-sufficient.
Yes.
So, when the Ibrahim report on governance came out, Dr. Malakish and I got very excited because not only is this an overall assessment of governance and the performance of governance for African countries, this issue this year did a retrospective. They looked at what has happened in the last 10 years in Africa. And those last 10 years were a time when both of us, who are actually really political economists, always interested in the interaction of politics and economics, when we personally have been very interested in security. Before that, we were, international economists roaming around the world, interested in trade and finance and other things. But, you had already written some books on security issues in Angola, and I also had started my career working on international affairs. But somehow we have come to this understanding that security is absolutely essential for development. And I realized that when I was on the board of the African Development Bank, a bank that worked very hard to develop projects, build projects in Africa. And when I was there in 2000 and 2001, we would sit and listen to lists of bank projects that had been totally destroyed. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Eritrea, Ethiopian War, all of those things, the genocide in Rwanda, all of those things had taken place in the years just before I arrived at the bank. And suddenly I came to grips with a profound understanding that there really could not be any real development without security. And yet it was complicated. And as you pointed out, like in the case of the Plan Colombia, you could not take one formula and impose it on another country. And so if there's any message that we come away with today, what I would hope is that you have that understanding that each country is unique and that the economic, the political, and the security are very, very closely intertwined. So we opened up our Ibrahim Index with news that we kind of knew was out there. That despite all the improvements in governance, and Dr. Malakish can tell you about all the improvements in economic performance, despite all of those improvements, 2/3 of the people in Africa are living in countries. They're living in a country where safety and the rule of law have deteriorated in the last decade. Now, in a way, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow what we've been talking about. We have better economic performance. We had, looking back from 2015, you had economies, many of them have been growing at 4% and 5% and 6% a year. Ethiopia, it's been 10% a year for 10 years. Same with Rwanda. So you've had all of this economic growth and higher standards of living, yet people feel less safe. And the nice thing about this index is that it's not simply statistics. Each one of the sub-indices does include statistics, the homicide rate and crime rates and things like that, actual conflicts, incidents of violence. But it also includes the results of surveys where you're asking people, do you feel safe in your house? And it's complicated by the fact that now people are more likely to feel safe in their house, but overall, they feel less safe because personal safety, traveling around, going on the street, terrible loss of life through Boko Haram, through attacks, through the war in Mali. So there have been all of these events taking place. You have 3 pieces in your reading that deal with the 3 dimensions that we spoke about: national security, economics, and management. So Paul Collier examines the threats that African countries are facing. The Economist surveys expenditures on military hardware, and the Institute for Defense Analyses in the U.S. studies best practices. I actually, as a central banker, don't believe that there is anything called best practices. Mm-hmm. I believe that we have what you call sound practices. And I guess I don't like the idea of best practices because that does seem to be, well, this is good, so you can take it from here to there. I think that you have sound practices that are guided by principles such as transparency, accountability, contestability. These are basic budget principles. If you understand the principles, then you can adapt it to the particular country, the particular set of challenges that you're facing. So the Ibrahim Index looked at what was going on in Africa. And if you look at the map there, what you see is enormous diversity. I like the fact that they chose red for the lowest performing, the least safe places, because when the town that I lived in Colombia became a zona roja just after I left. The FARC moved in and took over that town. So the groups that you see, the countries, and I think you'll recognize those countries. And when you look at the set of countries that are in the red zone, you have a better understanding of why it's 2/3 of Africans who are living in countries where security has deteriorated. It is countries with very large populations, such as Nigeria. And if you look at any statistics for life lost from terrorist attacks, Boko Haram is at the top of the list. It may not be in the newspapers every day, but the loss is daily. And the damage has been enormous throughout Nigeria and the nearby countries. But the countries that are in the lowest category, Nigeria has gone down a category, but it still remains above that red. It's in the medium low. The countries that are in the greatest danger zone are large countries such as Sudan. And also, Libya has the unique honor of having moved down 2 bands, 2 categories. What you have seen, and you think of a score, you think of a relative ranking, but you also need to think of performance over time. This is just a snapshot. But if you look at the index, it will make clear that 3 countries have moved up, including some that you just mentioned, Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, where both Raymond Gilpin and I lived. Those countries had a very well thought out security sector reforms, and they have been able to improve the well-being. But 11 countries had a deterioration. And some of those countries have a relatively large population. In particular, Sudan and Nigeria, although it didn't go all the way down to the low, it deteriorated from where it was before. So what we see then is that there's enormous diversity in Africa. And sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with how much you spend, but rather how well you spend it. Now, I'll give you an example. One of the countries with the highest level of security is a country that does not have an army. Now, I know that might seem impossible to you, right? But when they did their national security strategy, that is Mauritius, they determined that they did not need to have an army. They did determine that there were possible threats coming from overseas, but they were more likely to be related to organized crime, drug trafficking, people trafficking, so that what they needed was a very good police force with very good connections with Interpol. So they have been able to achieve the highest level of security without an army because they did a careful threat analysis and built a national security strategy based on that. The 3 countries that are at the top in terms of performance are, well, can someone guess what the other 2 might be? We've said Mauritius, Botswana, yes, and another small island state, Cape Verde, Cabo Verde. So it's not surprising. I was a member of the United Nations Committee on Development Policy. And when we looked at different countries, one thing became very obvious to me. I will also admit that I was once a school teacher, and so I may have a bias. But the countries that did well were those that had devoted attention to human capital. That is not that you have fewer problems than others, because certainly Mauritius, when I was in college, Mauritius was the example of Malthusian catastrophe. In the 50s and 60s, in the 60s when I was in college, they would tell you, oh, Mauritius, it's not only is it a one-crop country, sugar, it's a one-crop country in a hurricane zone. So you depend on sugar, and you're likely to lose your entire crop and thus all of your revenue at once and on a regular basis. It's not like you only have a storm once a decade. They came through regularly. Yet this country managed to move to independence with a political structure that was viable and that has remained viable. This country, by the way, was multi-ethnic. There were Chinese Mauritians, European Mauritians, African Mauritians, all, Indians, multi-ethnic. Yet somehow or other, this is a country with one of the highest standards of living in Africa, going from very poor monoculture to a diverse economy with a well-trained bureaucracy that is able to provide well-being for the citizens of the country. So there are different ways to get to the solution, but the important thing to remember is that the solution is unique for that country. And this idea that Dr. Gilpin had of growing organically, growing your institutions organically, depends on growing your institutions yourself. You asked about, well, what difference would that $100 billion make? Well, I think it makes a big difference if it's used to pay your civil servants. You look at the model of Singapore, where there was both a carrot and a stick approach. If you worked at the central bank, the Ministry of Commerce in Singapore, you actually made more than your counterparts in the private sector. But you were held accountable. So you had the carrot with the high pay. But if you were found to be negligent, to be involved in corrupt practices, then you suffered the consequences. You lost that job, and you would be liable for criminal prosecution. So the funds that are not being absorbed as tax revenue within the African countries could definitely be put to good use in developing human resources. Last year, I was doing a survey of resource management in Africa, speaking to experts in Africa, in the United States, and in Europe, by Skype and telephone in the case of Africa. I'm not like you jetting all over the world, but I did have the chance to meet some people face to face as they came to Washington for meetings. And I was troubled by what I heard. What we saw here in the report from the Ibrahim Index was presaged by the comments that they made to me, that many of them said, we've got to do more work in resource management because what we're seeing today is bad resource management is actually becoming a threat. So what is supposed to be a solution is becoming a threat. And I'll give you an example. In Mali, And you could say also in Nigeria, you had a situation where bad management and corruption meant that you had soldiers who were being sent to protect their country from either a terrorist or an insurgency, and yet they didn't have weapons. I mean, they literally didn't have weapons. And they found that they were overrun. Not having weapons was a threat to security, especially since that had been budgeted and it had been expected that they would be able to protect the population. So there's a refocus now on how do you first develop a national security strategy where you carefully define what the threats are to security in your country or in the local level in terms of the police, to your town, to your community, to your district. And then you design, through this whole budget process, whether you're talking about force structure, whether you're talking about other alternatives, whether you're talking about the role of intelligence, you design your security forces in a way to meet the specific threats of your country. Now, clearly, there's still going to be other challenges. This may come as a surprise to you who work in the U.S. government, but sometimes we don't share information. The interagency process can be very discouraging. So you have to have a clear sense of responsibility to each other and to the nation as a whole to get beyond, well, if I have this information, that means that my agency is, more powerful than the next one. Well, that's not very helpful if you have a threat that is meeting you right in the face. So what we have been looking at and what the Africa Center has been doing has been ways to conduct workshops and discussions where members of the security sector who are actively involved in managing resources can attend a workshop, share information, solve problems together to have a better understanding of how the principles that they're being introduced to can be applied in their own situation. So, yes, we need improvements in overall governance. Yes, we need improvements in economic well-being. But that's enough. That's not enough. Those are necessary to support the development of strong human resources and practices that support recruitment, training of the civilians and the uniformed staff to plan the budgets and conduct procurements. But it's necessary, but not sufficient. You have to limit corruption. You have to limit mismanagement. And so even though it's the last session that was called Accountability and Governance, it really is the main topic of this session. Accountability and governance are the keys to a better resource management practice in any country, whether they're African countries or right here in countries and counties right here in the United States. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.